My ungrateful son thought he could throw me out on the street. "You have 24 hours to get out of here," he shouted, his eyes shining with greed. The truth is, his ingratitude has never been a surprise to me. It was the only constant in his personality. That's why he never imagined the surprise I had prepared exactly for the day this would happen. I didn't argue. I just stared at him with the silence of someone watching a rat walk straight into a trap. The next day, it wasn't me who was out on the street. It was him receiving an unexpected visit with a court order in hand. My name is Elias, and at 72, I thought I'd seen it all. But what has happened to me recently proved that life, even in old age, still holds bitter surprises, and some sweet ones. It's true, but the sweetness came only after a storm that nearly dragged me to rock bottom. I had lived in the same house for over 40 years, a home filled with the memories of my dear Helen, my wife, the love of my life. Every corner of that house, from the rose bush she planted in the garden to the piano in the living room, held a piece of her, an echo of laughter, of whispered conversations, of a life built with so much care and dedication. My business, which I started from scratch with sweat and sacrifice, had flourished, guaranteeing my son Daniel a life far more comfortable than the one I'd had. My only ambition was for him to enjoy an existence without the hardships that shaped me, for him to focus on his dreams, knowing he had a safe harbor. However, ingratitude, like a silent weed, began to grow, nourished by my generosity and, I must confess, by the subtle yet dangerous influence of his wife, Paula. She was a woman of voracious ambition, whose intentions seemed murky, always lurking, calculating. I saw this poisonous plant spread. I saw the change in my son's eyes, as the loving boy transformed into a stranger who looked at me with a kind of veiled impatience. I had become an obstacle, a guardian of an estate they already believed was theirs by right, even before I was gone. The house was the last bastion of my presence, the sanctuary of my Helen, and they wanted it. I felt the heavy air in recent months, the way Paula avoided me, Daniel's increasingly short visits, always with an evasive glance. The final confrontation, when it came, was brutal and swift, though I had sensed it coming. It happened in the living room, the same place where I taught Daniel to take his first steps, where he played with his toy cars, where Helen and I celebrated every small victory. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a cruel contrast to the darkness consuming my heart. Daniel cornered me, his voice devoid of any trace of the boy I raised. His eyes, once full of filial affection, were now cold and hard, reflecting an unshakable decision. "Dad," he began, the title sounding like a burden, not an honor. "You have 24 hours to get out of here. We're selling the house. You're an old man. Deal with it." The last sentence, delivered with calculated cruelty, was a blow that resonated more than any shout, more than any physical threat. The coldness in his eyes told me that any appeal to love, to Helen's memory, would be useless. My throat tightened, but I didn't shed a tear. The pain of betrayal was a physical weight on my chest, an almost unbearable burden, but despair found no room in me. It couldn't. As I packed a small bag, taking only the essentials, a few clothes, Helen's glasses, a faded photograph of her with me at the beach, anger and sadness mingled with a strange sense of calm, because, anticipating the storm of his greed, I had years ago built a dam, a legal surprise, a silent trap, patiently waiting for this exact moment. The next day I knew it wouldn't be me looking for a place to live. It would be him, and that certainty, as painful as my departure was, gave me a strength I didn't know I still possessed. I walked out the door, looking back one last time, not at the house, but at the shadow of a past I now had to defend tooth and nail. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I had an ace up my sleeve, a secret that was about to be revealed, The hotel room door clicked shut, sealing my exit from what had been my home for decades. The silence of the new environment was heavy, almost oppressive, a stark contrast to the buzz of memories still echoing in my mind. I sat on the edge of the bed, the small suitcase at my feet, and a weary sigh escaped me. It wasn't despair nor regret, but a deep sadness, the melancholy of a forced farewell to a part of my life. I looked out the window at the city lights twinkling in the distance, each one representing a story, a life, a pain that might resemble my own. But the loneliness of that moment didn't consume me. Instead, it ignited a flame of determination. I was not a man to surrender. I never had been, and I wouldn't start now. The next morning, the hotel breakfast seemed tasteless, but I ate it with the discipline life had taught me. The hand holding the coffee cup did not tremble. There was a clarity in my thoughts, a calculated coolness I rarely had to summon. I knew what I had to do. From the comfort of that temporary room, I picked up my phone. The number for my attorney, Mr. Thompson, was saved not just in the device, but seared into my memory. Years ago, when I felt the first pang of apprehension about Daniel and Paula's growing greed, I had sought his counsel. We discussed options, scenarios, and together we drew up a plan I hoped never to activate, but which was now my only defense. I dialed the number, and Mr. Thompson's calm, professional voice answered. "Elias, good morning. Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone denoting the familiarity of a long relationship. "Mr. Thompson," I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. "The time has come. Please activate the irrevocable trust and the conduct clause." A short silence on the other end of the line, and then he replied, "Understood, Elias. I'll take care of everything immediately. You'll receive updates shortly." The call ended, and with it, a part of the weight on my shoulders seemed to lift. The legal gears had been set in motion, and I knew it wouldn't be long before Daniel felt the impact. Hours later, as if in a dance choreographed by fate, a process server knocked on the door of my house, or rather, the house Daniel now believed was his. I imagined the scene, the sharp rap on the wood, Daniel's surprised look as he opened it, the disbelief on his face as the impassive official handed him the envelope. My private investigator, a discreet and efficient man I had hired long ago, confirmed it all. Daniel, furious, received the notification. The surprise was simple and devastating. The house, along with the majority of my assets, was not in my name, but in the name of an irrevocable trust. I was the lifetime trustee, and he, my son, was the beneficiary. However, the document contained a conduct clause, drafted by Mr. Thompson years ago, which stipulated that any act of abuse, neglect, or attempt to remove the trustee from his residence would result in the beneficiary's immediate and permanent exclusion. By kicking me out, Daniel hadn't just thrown me onto the street, he had signed his own disinheritance. The news must have hit him like a lightning bolt from a clear blue sky. I pictured his face contorting in a mixture of fury and shock. Paula by his side, perhaps with an initial smirk that quickly turned into a scowl of rage. The walls of the house, once witnesses to our happiness, would now be the stage for their wrath. My investigator told me about the yelling, the disbelief, the fury emanating from the home he thought he had conquered. Daniel called Mr. Thompson, demanding an explanation, only to be informed that the clause was ironclad and the decision irrevocable. The seed of greed, which he and Paula had watered for so long, had now turned against them. I knew their reaction wouldn't be one of acceptance. Ingratitude doesn't surrender easily, and blind ambition rarely retreats without a fight. And the fight, I felt, was just beginning. They wouldn't accept defeat. Daniel and Paula's reaction came quickly, just as I had foreseen. The news that the house and the bulk of the estate were locked in an irrevocable trust, with a conduct clause that disinherited them, must have felt like a judgment from on high. My investigator, A reliable and discreet source kept me updated. I could imagine the fury on Daniel's face, perhaps a mirror of the anger his mother, Helen, would have felt to see greed consume her son. And Paula, her ambition, which I had so feared, now manifested in an even crueler form. I knew she wouldn't back down. Defeat was not an option for her, and she would drag Daniel into battle with her, no matter the cost. The first volley came in the form of a lawsuit. They sued me, claiming I was mentally incompetent to manage the trust, that the conduct clause was abusive, and that I was senile. Their audacity sent a chill down my spine, not of fear, but of disbelief. How could they twist reality so blatantly? Mr. Thompson, my attorney, assured me it was a common tactic in inheritance disputes, a desperate attempt to invalidate my will and reverse the situation. But knowing that didn't lessen the bitterness I felt. Daniel, my own son, was publicly accusing me of being insane, of being a decrepit old man, just to satisfy his greed. The pain of that betrayal was almost unbearable. As if the legal battle wasn't enough, they launched a smear campaign among friends and family. Phone calls, visits, whispered conversations that reached my ears like barbs. I was painted as a bitter and controlling old man, a tyrant using his money to manipulate his son's life. Old friends, people with whom I'd shared barbecues and celebrations, now looked at me with suspicion, some with pity, others with a silent judgment that hurt more than any open words. Messages of concern turned into insidious questions, into insinuations about my mental health. I felt isolated, as if I were on a stage, and all the spotlights were on me, not on the truth, but on the distorted version they had created. I was being forced to fight not just for my home and my assets, but for my very sanity in the eyes of the world. Every time a friend called to see how I was doing, I could feel the tinge of doubt in their voice, the suggestion that maybe, just maybe, Daniel had a point. It was exhausting. My nights were filled with reflections on how life can take such cruel turns, how a father's love can be so twisted by greed. I wondered if I had failed at some point, if I had given Daniel too much, depriving him of the chance to build his own path, to understand the value of hard work. But the bitterness couldn't consume me. I had to hold my head high for Helen, for myself, and for the truth. As the legal battle dragged on, Mr. Thompson worked tirelessly, collecting depositions, preparing the defense. But I felt a piece was missing, something that would explain Daniel and Paula's haste and ferocity. It wasn't just the house, it was something more urgent, more desperate. I could sense it in the tone of their accusations, in the intensity of their attacks. That desperation, that urgency wasn't born just from the frustration of losing an inheritance. There was something else, a hidden engine behind all that ingratitude, something driving them to act so ruthlessly. And I was determined to find out what it was. This feeling of something larger and darker lurking in the shadows gave me chills, a premonition that the truth, when it surfaced, would be even more painful than I imagined. The game was far from over, and I knew they still had other cards to play, cards that could be far more dangerous. The feeling that there was something more behind Daniel and Paula's haste and virulence wouldn't leave me. It was a gut feeling, a knot in my stomach that tightened with every new slander, every baseless claim in court. They weren't just fighting for an inheritance. They were fighting for something much more urgent, something that drove them to sever family ties and twist the truth without hesitation. The ingratitude, as painful as it was, didn't explain the ferocity of their attacks. There seemed to be an underlying desperation, a fear that compelled them to such extreme measures. I found myself watching people in the hotel, trying to decipher their expressions, searching the crowd for a sign of the kindness that seemed to have been lost in my own family. The solitude, paradoxically, sharpened my senses, making me more observant, more analytical. It wasn't long before I made a decision. Mr. Thompson, with his legal expertise, was excellent, but I needed someone who could go beyond the court filings, someone who could investigate the darker corners of Daniel and Paula's lives. I hired a new investigator, a man named Ray, middle-aged, with a sharp eye and a reputation for discretion and efficiency. I explained my suspicions to him, the feeling that the money from the house was just a symptom of a larger problem. Ray listened intently, without interrupting, his eyes fixed on mine, absorbing every word, every nuance of my pain and my determination. He assured me he would do everything in his power to uncover the truth, promising absolute confidentiality. The following days were a mixture of anxious waiting and the exhausting routine of the legal process. Every meeting with Mr. Thompson, every deposition I had to sign, every time I read their claims about my mental incompetence, it reinforced the need to discover the root of so much malice. I wondered how Daniel, the boy I once held in my arms, could have turned into someone capable of such cruelty. Memories of Helen, of her unwavering kindness, gave me strength. She would never have accepted seeing her son act this way, and I felt I was fighting for her memory as well, for everything we built together. Ray called me sporadically with fragmented information, small pieces of a puzzle I couldn't yet see in its entirety. He spoke of excessive spending, of mounting debts, of a lifestyle that Daniel and Paula were leading that seemed far beyond their means. They're living a life for show, Elias, he told me once, his voice serious. There are a lot of loans, some with sky-high interest rates. It's like they're trying to maintain a facade at all costs. Each call from Ray was like a small blow, a painful confirmation that my suspicions were correct. My son was in trouble, and the way he chose to handle it was by trying to destroy me. The truth was beginning to take shape, and though painful, it brought me a strange clarity. Ingratitude wasn't the main driver. It was a byproduct of a growing financial desperation. They didn't just want me out of the house out of greed. They needed that money. They needed it desperately. But for what? The question hammered in my mind. What debt could be so large, so pressing, as to justify such a betrayal? The uncertainty was agonizing, but I knew I was close to the truth, a truth that, I feared, would be even more bitter than the accusations I already faced. Ray promised a more complete update soon, and I waited, with a heavy heart, for the next chapter of this painful revelation. With each passing day, the legal battle grew more intricate, and their smear campaign more aggressive. The allegations of my mental incompetence seemed to echo in the halls of my own mind, not because I believed them, but because of the persistence with which they were repeated. I felt like a boat in a stormy sea, the waves of lies crashing against me, trying to capsize me. However, the determination Helen had always admired in me kept my rudder steady. I spent my hours in the hotel, between meetings with Mr. Thompson, who brought me the dry, cold details of the case, and calls from Ray, who painted an increasingly grim picture of Daniel and Paula's financial situation. The contrast between the coldness of the courtroom and the personal pain was a heavy burden. The revelation I had been waiting for came on a rainy afternoon. The phone rang, and it was Ray. His voice, usually calm, had a note of urgency. "Elias, I have something important," he began. "Their rush to sell the house isn't just greed, it's pure desperation. Daniel lost a fortune in high-risk investments. We're talking millions. Elias, debts they can't possibly cover. The house is their last-ditch effort to avoid total ruin before the creditors come knocking." A knot formed in my throat. The money, the coveted inheritance, was to plug a black hole of debt, not to fulfill dreams. The desperation now had a name, a face. The surprise of the revelation hit me hard. The debt, the immense debt, was the engine. Ingratitude was the facade. Desperation the fuel. This was the missing piece of the puzzle. Suddenly, the virulence of their actions, the rush to get me out of the house, the smear campaign, it all clicked into place. They couldn't afford to wait, to be patient. Time was running out. And the house was the only way out they saw. I felt a mixture of anger and a strange compassion. Anger for how they treated me, for the betrayal, for the lies, but also a sliver of pity to see them entangled in a web of debt, forced into such desperate acts. "Are you sure, Ray?" I asked, my voice choked. "Absolutely, Elias. I have statements, communications. Everything indicates Daniel's investments collapsed. And he and Paula are desperately trying to cover the losses. The house, your trust fund, is their only chance, or it was before the conduct clause." Ray's confirmation solidified the harsh truth. My son, Daniel, was mired in a calamitous financial situation, and the solution he and Paula devised was to try and strip me of everything I had left. The pain of betrayal deepened, but now it was accompanied by a clear understanding of the abyss they were in. I sat in the armchair in my room, watching the rain streak down the window pane. This wasn't just a battle over property, it was a fight to unmask the truth behind a greed fed by overwhelming fear. The road ahead would be even harder, I knew. The legal defense would gain new momentum with this information, but the emotional battle would be exhausting. Cornered, they would do anything to bring me down, and I felt, in the pit of my stomach, that their next move would be even dirtier, even more dangerous than anything they had tried before. Their rush to have me declared incompetent, to label me as senile, now made perfect sense. If I were deemed incapacitated, the trust could be challenged, and they would get access to the money. The idea solidified in my mind, a chilling premonition. They would try to forge evidence. They would go beyond slander, seeking a more conclusive way to silence me. And I knew they wouldn't hesitate to use the filthiest tools to achieve their goals at any cost. The revelation of Daniel's astronomical debt and his and Paula's desperation to settle it brought a painful clarity to my mind. This was no longer just about ingratitude, it was about survival, albeit in a twisted, selfish way. That understanding, on one hand, explained the ferocity of their attacks, but on the other, it didn't lessen the pain of the betrayal. On the contrary, it deepened it. I, who had always striven to give Daniel a life without worry, now saw myself as the last obstacle to the ruin that he, driven by Paula, had built for himself. The nights in the hotel grew longer, and sleep more elusive. The memories of Helen, of her soft voice and wise counsel, were my only solace. I wondered what she would do if she were here, how she would handle the loss and disappointment I felt. My premonition from the previous chapter came true in a manner even crueler than I had imagined. They wouldn't back down. With each day, the pressure mounted. Meetings with Mr. Thompson became more tense, and the look of concern on his face deepened. He warned me about the seriousness of the accusations, the difficulty of fighting the public perception of someone being incompetent once the seed of doubt is planted. And then the lowest blow came. During one of the preliminary hearings, Daniel and Paula's lawyers presented a medical report, a forged document signed by a bought-off doctor, attesting to my cognitive decline and my inability to manage my own affairs. The hearing room spun around me, the air seemed to thin, and a sharp ringing filled my ears. I looked at Daniel, sitting next to Paula, and saw a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. Paula, for her part, maintained an expression of false concern, a mask of sadness that barely concealed her triumph. That image, the deceit stamped on their faces, made my blood boil. The audacity of forging such a crucial document, of trying to disqualify me in the most humiliating way, was unspeakable. For a brief, terrible moment, a subtle doubt crept into my own mind. Was I, deep down, really losing my grip? Their campaign was so effective, so insidious, that it almost made me question my own sanity. Mr. Thompson, visibly shocked, requested time to analyze the document. His lips were pressed into a thin line, and his eyes, which usually conveyed professional calm, now shone with indignation. He knew, and I knew, that this was a desperate and illegal maneuver, but the proof was there on letterhead with signatures and stamps that looked legitimate. How could we prove the fraud without irrefutable counter-evidence? How could we fight a lie so well constructed, one that preyed on the vulnerability of an elderly man? My friends and family, who were already divided by the gossip, would now have a document to solidify their doubts. I felt the ground beneath my feet crumbling, the loneliness becoming a chasm. The weight of that report was immense. It seemed for a moment that their lie might actually defeat the truth. I felt exhausted, the legal and emotional battle consuming me. Hopelessness, a feeling I had fought to keep at bay, began to creep in. Was this the end? Would I have to surrender to this cruel farce, be stripped not only of my assets, but of my dignity and sanity? The thought of being declared incompetent, of having my life controlled by those who tried to destroy me, was unbearable. I was in a corner, with no light in sight, when the hotel phone rang, an unexpected ring that broke the oppressive silence. It was an unknown number. I hesitated for a second, then answered, "Mr. Elias?" The voice on the other end, familiar and soft, asked, "It's Maria, the former housekeeper from your home. I think I have something you're going to want to see." My heart leaped. Maria, what could she possibly have? And why would she contact me now, after all this time? Maria's soft, hesitant voice on the phone broke through the dense fog of despair that had enveloped me. Maria. Her name brought a flood of memories, not of sadness, but of comfort. She had worked for Helen and me for over 20 years, a discreet woman of few words, but with an enormous heart. Her loyalty to my wife was unquestionable, a bond of mutual respect I had always admired. What could she have? Why would she reach out now, in the midst of this storm? My mind, previously clouded by exhaustion and pain, lit up with a spark of hope. We agreed to meet at a quiet cafe, far from the prying eyes and attentive ears I knew were lurking. I arrived early, my heart beating a little faster than usual. When Maria walked in, her small frame and teary eyes brought to the surface the pain she must have also felt about the situation. She sat across from me, placing a worn handbag on the floor. "Mr. Elias," she began, her voice choked with emotion, "I couldn't stand to see what they were doing to you anymore. Mrs. Helen, she would never have allowed it. She trusted you more than anything." Her words, filled with a truth I had been yearning for, were a balm to my wounded soul. She hesitated for a moment, glancing around the cafe as if afraid of being overheard, before opening her bag and taking out a rectangular, dusty object. It was an old tablet, its screen slightly scratched. This was Daniel's Mr. Elias. He left it in a desk drawer when he moved into the main house. I kept it, I'm not sure why, but one day I turned it on out of curiosity and saw some things that made me afraid. But after I heard about the report, I knew I had to bring this to you. She handed me the tablet, and my fingers felt its weight, a weight that seemed to carry not just electronics, but secrets. As I held it, a surge of adrenaline coursed through my body. Here it was, in my hands, a potential weapon, a key to unmasking their charade. Maria, with her quiet loyalty, had brought me a gift of inestimable value. She told me that Daniel, in his haste to kick me out and take control, had left many things behind, thinking no one would dare touch his belongings. The housekeeper, who had always kept the house impeccable, found the device and, moved by intuition and fidelity to Helen's memory, decided to save it. It was her innocence and goodness that had revealed the truth more than any cleverness of my own. Back at the hotel, with Mr. Thompson by my side, I turned on the tablet. The screen lit up, revealing an old but functional interface. Mr. Thompson, with his usual caution, advised me not to touch anything before having a computer expert make a forensic copy. We hired a specialist who worked diligently. Hours of agonizing waiting passed, and then the expert, his eyes wide, called us over. Amidst old files and family photos, he had found what we needed. A series of emails exchanged between Daniel, Paula, and the doctor who signed the false report. The messages were explicit, openly discussing the plan to have me declared incompetent, the amounts paid for the forged assessment, and even how they would manage the trust fund once I was out of the way. My eyes scanned the words on the screen, and each sentence was a punch to the gut, but also an overwhelming validation. They had planned everything with calculated coldness, scheming to strip me of everything, including my dignity. The anger, the sadness, the disappointment, all these feelings mixed with a silent cry of, "I knew it." The truth, finally, was stark and raw before me, irrefutable. The pain was immense, but the proof was there, solid, unquestionable. For a moment, I felt Helen's presence beside me, as if she were whispering, "You're not alone, Elias. The truth always finds a way." The forged report, the weapon they used to destroy me, would now become their own undoing. The tables had turned, and I knew that in court, the next round would be the decisive one. Mr. Thompson, a glint of determination in his eyes, looked at me and said, "Elias, they just signed their own conviction. The show is about to begin." The battle wasn't won yet, but now we had the ammunition, and I couldn't wait to use it. The forensic copy of the emails, revealing the sordid conspiracy to discredit me and usurp my estate, was like an electric shock. My eyes, once clouded by the pain of betrayal, now burned with a mixture of anger and a cold determination. Daniel and Paula had schemed with chilling detachment, discussing in detail the plan to label me as senile, to remove me from everything I had built. Their words, in digital print, were an irrefutable testament to their malice. My son, the same boy who, at a tender age, wrote clumsy little notes to his mother on Mother's Day, was now orchestrating a plan to strip me of my own mind. The pain of seeing that transformation was excruciating, a wound that seemed to deepen with every word I read. Mr. Thompson, with the stack of evidence in his hands, was visibly shaken. A man accustomed to the intricacies of the law, he rarely showed such indignation. "This is Elias. This is unbelievable. The evidence we had has just turned into an atomic bomb," he murmured, his voice serious and almost hoarse. Ray, my investigator, who was also present, shook his head in agreement. "They underestimated you, Elias, and they underestimated Maria. Sometimes, the simplest people are the ones who hold the greatest truths." The mention of Maria brought a warmth to my chest. That woman, with her quiet kindness, had been the guardian angel I didn't know I needed. We decided that the contents of the tablet would be kept an absolute secret until the right moment in court. The element of surprise would be our greatest weapon. While Mr. Thompson and his team worked tirelessly to prepare the presentation of this evidence, I found myself immersed in a whirlwind of emotions. The anger was undeniable, but it was accompanied by a deep sadness for the irreparable loss of the relationship with my son. I remembered the summers we spent together, fishing at the lake, the talks about Daniel's future, my dreams for him. How had he strayed so far? Paula's influence, with her unmeasured ambition, was evident in the emails, but Daniel was not a child. He had made his own choices, choices that led him to this abyss. Despite the proof in my hands, the smear campaign continued. Phone calls from old acquaintances, always with the same veiled concern. The same questions about my health. I listened to them with a forced smile, knowing that soon the truth would come out, but the wait was agonizing. I felt like an actor in a play, forced to perform the role of a frail victim while, inside, I was seething with resolve. The loneliness of the hotel, which had once seemed like a refuge, now became a weight, a constant reminder of the home I had lost and the family that was shattering. I missed the simplicity of my days with Helen, the casual conversations, the comfort of a home. The proximity of the final hearing was palpable. Each passing day brought me closer to the moment when I would have to confront Daniel and Paula, not just with words, but with the raw truth of their own actions. My heart was heavy with the duality of wanting justice and, at the same time, feeling immense pain at having to expose my own son to such public humiliation. I wondered if, deep down, Daniel felt any remorse, any pang of shame. But every time I saw him in the courthouse hallways, his eyes were cold, his posture rigid. There was no glimpse of the boy I raised, only the image of a stranger hardened by greed. Mr. Thompson warned me that they would certainly intensify their attacks, sensing that time was running out. And he was right. In the days leading up to the decisive hearing, new allegations emerged, even more absurd, about my supposed incapacity, about irresponsible spending I had supposedly engaged in. They were trying to sling as much mud as possible, hoping some of it would stick. It was a desperate strategy, but effective in confusing public opinion. I knew their next and final move would be even riskier, a final attempt to seal my doom. The pressure intensified, and uncertainty hung in the air. The final hearing was scheduled, and I knew that there, in front of everyone, the truth would finally be revealed. But until then, I had to withstand every blow, keep my faith unshakable, and hope that justice would prevail. The tension was almost unbearable, but I would not back down. Not now. The tension before the trial's climax was palpable, like the charged air before a thunderstorm. I felt like an old oak tree, with deep roots, but with its branches being shaken by merciless winds. Each dawn in the hotel was a reminder of the approaching battle, and each sunset a countdown to the final confrontation. I relived conversations with Helen, imagining how she would react to each new lie, each new accusation. Her wisdom and serenity were the anchors that kept me steady in the storm. I felt that, somehow, she was with me, giving me the strength not to give up. In the days leading up to the decisive hearing, Daniel and Paula's strategy became even more aggressive. They intensified their smear campaign, not just among friends and family, but also in business circles, trying to tarnish my professional reputation. They even went so far as to send anonymous letters filled with slander about my ability to manage the business I had built myself. I found myself forced to deny baseless rumors, to reaffirm my integrity to people who, until then, had never questioned my word. It was a multi-pronged attack, targeting not only my sanity but also my legacy. Mr. Thompson, a true general in wartime, prepared me meticulously for the clash. We reviewed every detail, every possible scenario, every question they might ask me. He instructed me to remain calm, to answer with clarity and honesty, and not to let myself be rattled by the provocations that would surely come. "They're going to try to destabilize you, Elias," he warned. "But your truth is your greatest strength. Keep your eyes on the prize, justice." His words gave me courage, but anxiety was a constant companion. I slept little, dreaming of the house, of Helen, of a time when the word family didn't carry such a heavy weight of pain. I wondered, in moments of solitude, if Daniel, in some corner of his heart, felt the weight of his actions, if he remembered the moments of affection, the sacrifices I made for him. But when I saw him in court, the image presented was of a hardened man with no trace of filial affection. His eyes avoided mine, or, when they did meet them, they were cold and distant. Paula, by his side, seemed the personification of implacability, her gestures calculated, her gaze icy. It was as if greed had sucked any remnant of humanity from both of them. The revelation of the emails, with the irrefutable proof of their conspiracy, was our trump card. But the wait to play it was agonizing. I knew that in court they would try to humiliate me one more time, using the forged report as their last desperate move. I imagined their lawyers, with their pompous voices, painting a picture of a senile and paranoid old man trying to invalidate my every word. I felt a lump in my throat just thinking about it, but I also felt a flame of hope, a certainty that the truth, however painful, would finally be revealed. The eve of the final hearing was the longest of all. I didn't sleep. I spent the night mentally reviewing every moment, every word, every emotion. I knew I was about to face not just a court, but the disillusionment of a lifetime, the breaking of a sacred bond. But I also knew I was fighting for something bigger, for dignity, for justice, for Helen's memory. It wasn't just about the house or the money. It was about the truth. And I was ready to fight for it, whatever the cost. The morning came, bringing with it not just the sun, but the promise of an outcome, for better or for worse. The stage was set, and I, Elias, was ready for my role in the story. Not as a victim, but as a man who refused to be silenced. I was exhausted, but resolute, and despite the pain, there was a feeling that something momentous was about to happen, something that would change everyone's lives forever. The day of the decisive hearing arrived with a cold, pale light that seemed to mirror the tense atmosphere inside the courtroom. I sat next to Mr. Thompson, feeling the weight of everyone's gaze on me. My eyes, though tired, scanned the room, taking in every detail. Daniel and Paula's lawyers, with their confident and calculated expressions. Daniel, visibly tense, his jaw clenched in defiance. And Paula, who maintained a rigid posture, a forced smile on her lips, but with anxious eyes. The public gallery was full, with some familiar faces, friends I hadn't seen in a long time, whom I hoped to look in the eye again after the truth was revealed. It was a cruel spectacle, where a man's life was dissected in public. The courtroom proceedings began. Daniel and Paula's lawyers opened with a performance I had expected. With dramatic voices and rehearsed gestures, they painted a picture of a senile and unstable father who, in his cognitive decline, had created an abusive and irrational clause to punish his son for insignificant reasons. They presented witnesses who, with carefully selected testimony, corroborated the narrative of a controlling and embittered old man. Every word was a stab, every insinuation a blow to my dignity. I forced myself to remain calm, remembering Mr. Thompson's instructions, breathing deeply and focusing on the certainty that the truth would come out. The most impactful moment of their defense was the presentation of the forged medical report. The doctor, a respectable-looking man, took the stand and, in a slow, convincing voice, described my supposed cognitive decline using technical terms that seemed unassailable. He detailed a series of symptoms, some I had never experienced, others that were exaggerated distortions of minor, age-related forgetfulness. He seemed genuine, and I saw Mr. Thompson press his lips together. I could feel the gazes from the gallery on me, the doubt solidifying on some faces. For an instant, the fear that this lie might prevail washed over me, a chill running down my spine. But I was not alone. I felt a warmth on my hand, and when I looked, it was Mr. Thompson who had subtly touched it, a sign that he was there, standing firm by my side. His presence reassured me. When the doctor finished his testimony, and Daniel and Paula's lawyers turned to the judge with an air of triumph, it was our turn. The atmosphere in the room shifted. Mr. Thompson stood up, his posture imposing, and his voice, which had been calm, now gaining a new intensity. He didn't offer a defense. He launched a formal accusation. The silence in the courtroom was nearly absolute, broken only by the sound of his resonant voice. He began by presenting the statute of the irrevocable trust, reading the conduct clause aloud and clearly, explaining every detail of its legality and purpose. His eyes scanned the room, fixing on Daniel and Paula for a moment before turning to the judge. The tension was almost suffocating. I could see Daniel shifting restlessly in his chair, and Paula, for the first time, seemed to have lost her composure, her eyes wide, the forced smile vanishing from her lips. Mr. Thompson had only just begun, and I knew the final blow was coming. I could feel relief starting to flow through my veins, the certainty that the truth, at last, would come to light. Daniel's face was pale, and Paula's now showed a growing panic. The stage was set for the most devastating revelation of all, and I prepared myself to witness it with a mixture of pain and vindication. Justice was on its way, and with it, the long-awaited but bitter liberation. The silence in the courtroom was almost tangible as Mr. Thompson finished laying out the legality of the trust and the irrefutable validity of the conduct clause. Daniel and Paula's lawyers, who had previously displayed a calculated arrogance, now seemed to shrink in their chairs, their gazes shifting restlessly. Daniel, once tense, now appeared petrified, his eyes locked on Mr. Thompson as if trying to decipher his next move. Paula, who had maintained a mask of false calm, was starting to lose her color, her lips moving in a silent, anguished plea. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the turning of the tables, the revelation that would change everything. I felt a cold knot in my stomach, a mixture of anxiety and a strange sense of calm. The truth was one step away from being unveiled. "Your Honor," Mr. Thompson continued, his voice now deeper, beyond the trust statute, "we have compelling evidence of the real motive that led the defendant Daniel and his wife to attempt to strip Mr. Elias of his assets and his dignity." He paused dramatically, letting the suspense hang in the air, while I watched the scene with a mix of apprehension and a hint of bitter satisfaction. Mr. Elias, with his sharp insight, realized that the haste and ferocity of their attacks were not justified by greed alone. There was an underlying desperation, and he was correct. Mr. Thompson then presented the evidence of Daniel's colossal debt, detailing the high-risk investments that had failed and the urgent need to cover the losses. He projected bank statements, loan documents, and transaction records onto the courtroom screen. With each document displayed, Daniel's face contorted, and Paula, beside him, buried her face in her hands, panic evident in her posture. The courtroom, previously in near religious silence, began to whisper with murmurs of surprise and indignation. Friends and family in the gallery, who had looked at me with doubt, now watched me with a mix of pity and bewilderment. The picture Mr. Thompson painted was of a family in financial ruin, willing to do anything to avoid collapse. Ingratitude was not the end, it was merely the means. But Mr. Thompson still held the final blow. "And finally, Your Honor," he said, his voice echoing through the room, "and we would like to present the true reason the defendant and his wife attempted to have Mr. Elias declared mentally incompetent and the irrefutable proof of their conspiracy." With a precise gesture, he signaled to the computer expert, who was ready with the tablet. The large screen, previously displaying financial statements, now showed the old device's interface, followed by a sequence of emails. The entire room held its breath. The emails, exchanged between Daniel, Paula, and the doctor, were projected for all to read. The words were clear, concise, and devastating. They discussed the plan to forge the report, the sums paid to the doctor, the strategy to remove me from the trust. The voices of Daniel and Paula, once only in my painful memories, now echoed, cold and calculating, in digital terms for all to see. The humiliation of Daniel and Paula was total. They couldn't deny it, couldn't hide. The evidence was there, irrefutable, exposing their conspiracy of fraud and forgery for everyone to witness. Daniel shot to his feet, his chair crashing to the floor, his face red with fury and shame. Paula, beside him, was in tears, sobbing uncontrollably. Their lawyer tried to argue, but his words were drowned out by the commotion in the room. The judge, with a stern expression and a firm voice, banged her gavel. "Order in the court!" she exclaimed. The climax had been reached, and the truth finally had triumphed. Justice was about to be served, but I felt a bitter taste in my mouth. The victory was mine, but at a terrible cost, the ruin of my own son. I wondered what would happen next. What would the judge do with this mountain of evidence? The fate of Daniel and Paula was sealed, and mine, at last, was free to begin again. The judge's gavel rang out, silencing the commotion that had erupted with the display of the emails. Daniel and Paula's humiliation was palpable, visible on their contorted faces and in their defeated postures. Daniel, who had jumped up in a fit of rage and shame, was now back in his chair, his shoulders slumped, the image of a broken man. Paula, beside him, sobbed uncontrollably, her makeup streaked by tears. The mask of arrogance and triumph they had worn for so long had shattered, revealing the fragility and desperation behind their actions. I watched them, without joy, without rancor, only with a profound sadness for the destruction they had wrought and for what was to come. The judge, with a grave expression, addressed the court. In light of the irrefutable evidence presented by Mr. Thompson, this court not only dismisses the lawsuit brought by the defendants Daniel and Paula against Mr. Elias, but also, due to the severity of the evidence of fraud, document forgery, and attempted deprivation of civil rights, orders the opening of a criminal investigation against Daniel, Paula, and Dr. Marcus Evans, the physician responsible for the forged report. With each of the judge's words, the weight on my chest seemed to lessen. It was the validation I needed, the confirmation that justice, however slow, would finally prevail. What followed was controlled chaos. Daniel and Paula's lawyers tried to argue, but their voices were silenced by the judge's firm decision. Daniel and Paula were escorted from the courtroom, their faces flushed with shame and panic. I remained in my seat, exhausted, but with an overwhelming sense of relief washing over me. Mr. Thompson, with a discreet smile, squeezed my hand. "Congratulations, Elias, the truth won." But the victory for me had a bitter taste. I had won a battle, but lost a son. Justice had been served, but at an immense human cost. I returned to the hotel. The once oppressive silence of the room now a refuge. I needed to process everything that had happened, the dramatic turn of events, the downfall of Daniel and Paula. There was no celebration in my heart, only a deep melancholy. I sat in the armchair, my hands trembling, and memories of Daniel as a child came flooding back. His infectious laugh, his tight hugs, the drawings he would give me. How could love turn into something so destructive? I wondered if I had failed at some point, if I had given him too much or too little of the ability to discern right from wrong. The night was long and filled with reflection. I knew the criminal investigation would change their lives forever. The possibility of prison, the stain on their names, the loss of their reputation. It was all the result of their own choices. I took no pleasure in their suffering, but I felt it was necessary. It was a hard lesson, not just for them, but for me as well. The lesson that love sometimes must be firm, must set boundaries, even if it causes pain. The next morning, a day after the court's decision, the hotel phone rang. It was the front desk, informing me I had a visitor. My heart raced. Who could it be? My investigator, Ray, had already updated me, so had Mr. Thompson. I hesitated, then told them to let him up. The knock on the door was soft, almost hesitant. I opened it, and there he was, Daniel. His face was swollen, his eyes red and puffy, his shoulders slumped in a posture I had never seen before. He no longer had his arrogance nor his coldness. He was broken, abandoned by his wife, and facing the real possibility of prison. The sight of my son there, shattered, caused a lump in my throat. He didn't ask for money, nor did he try to argue about the house. He begged me to drop the complaint. "Dad," he said, his voice choked, "please, drop the complaint. I've lost everything. Paula left me. I have nowhere to go." The pain in his eyes was genuine, and for a moment I saw a glimpse of my lost son. But the memory of the lies, the humiliation, the forged report was still too fresh. I looked at him, the stranger wearing my son's face, and knew I had to give him an answer that would define not only his future, but my own. My decision would be the end point of an era and the beginning of an uncertain path for both of us. I knew my response would be the hardest lesson of his life, and perhaps the most important. The silence in the hotel hallway after Daniel's desperate plea was so thick it felt crushing. I watched him stand before me, the very picture of a defeated man. The arrogance had vanished, replaced by a raw, almost childlike desperation. His words echoed in my ears. "Dad, please, drop the complaint. I've lost everything. Paula left me. I have nowhere to go." It was the same plea as a boy who falls and asks for help. But the eyes of a betrayed man saw the marks of a much more complex journey. The pain he showed was genuine, and that, somehow, made my own pain even deeper. I took a deep breath, searching for the clarity that only years of experience can bring. This was not the moment for anger, nor for blind compassion. It was the moment for truth, for a lesson he needed to learn. I looked him in the eye, and I didn't see the innocent son of long ago, but the man he had become. "Daniel," I began, my voice hoarse but steady, "I will not drop the complaint against the doctor, nor against Paula. Their actions went beyond a mistake. They were crimes, and they must answer for them." The mention of Paula made his expression harden for an instant, a reflection of the resentment he surely felt for her having abandoned him. But for Daniel, I knew the story was different. He was my son, and despite all the pain, there was still a thread, however tenuous, of paternal love. "As for you, Daniel," I continued, my voice a little softer but still heavy with unwavering seriousness, "I offer you a choice. You can face the justice system, the consequences of your actions, the prison time that will surely come, or you can accept a new chance, a chance to start from scratch without a penny to my name, without the shadow of my estate." He looked at me, his eyes wide, hope mingling with shock. "You can accept a real job, an entry-level position in the warehouse of my old company, the company I once built with my own 2 hands. I gave him an ultimatum, an opportunity for redemption that I knew would be the hardest road he had ever walked. "You will start at the bottom. Like anyone else, you will learn the value of work, the value of effort, the value of what is built with one's own hands. There will be no privileges, no shortcuts. You will have to prove to yourself, not to me, but to yourself, that you are capable of building something of value." Daniel was silent for a long moment, his eyes downcast, processing the gravity of my words. I knew it was a humiliating proposal for him, the man who dreamed of inheriting an empire, but it was also the only way out I could offer him so that he wouldn't be lost completely. Finally, he lifted his head, and in his eyes I saw a flicker, not of greed, but of a new understanding, a spark of humility I hadn't seen in years. "I'll take it, Dad," he said, his voice choked but firm. "I'll take it." A heavy sigh escaped my lips. It was the first step, a painful but necessary one, toward his redemption. I moved back into my house, the home that had been the stage for so much pain and would now be the setting for a new beginning. The silence of my memories was still there, but now it was accompanied by a new sense of peace. I had won the legal battle, yes, but at a terrible cost, the relationship with my son. However, I had also planted a seed, a hope that Daniel could find his own path, his own worth, without depending on my name or my money. I sat in the living room, the same place where he had told me to leave, and looked at the photograph of Helen. "We won, my love," I whispered. But the victory was just the beginning of a journey. The journey of rebuilding, not just a family, but a life. I knew the road would be long, but the seed of hope had been planted, and I, Elias, would be there to see if it would blossom. Returning to the house after so many months of forced absence was like rediscovering an old friend who had endured great hardship. Every room, every object seemed to breathe with the stories it had witnessed. The sunlight streamed through the living room window, dancing on the dust motes in the air, just as it had on the day Daniel kicked me out. But the atmosphere was different now. The tension had dissipated, replaced by a quiet, almost solemn calm. I sat in my favorite spot, on the sofa Helen and I had chosen together, and for a long time I just watched the garden through the window. The rose bushes she had so loved, a little neglected but still resilient, reminded me of the strength of life and the endurance of nature. The victory in court brought legal peace, but inner peace was a slower construction, a garden that needed to be cultivated with care. The nights in the hotel, filled with anxiety and sadness, gave way to more restful sleep. But the memory of Daniel's broken and repentant gaze still visited me. I knew the wound in our relationship would take time to heal, if it ever healed completely. But the choice he made, to accept the job in the warehouse, was a ray of hope. It was the first step for him to understand that true value lies not in what one inherits, but in what one builds with one's own hands, with sweat and dignity. The following months settled into a different routine. I reconnected with the house, with Helen's memories, feeling her presence in every corner, in every silence. I returned to tending the garden, watering the rose bushes, a therapeutic act that connected me to the past and anchored me in the present. Mr. Thompson kept me informed about the criminal investigation against Paula and the doctor. The evidence was overwhelming, and they would face the consequences of their actions. As for Daniel, I kept my distance, a necessary distance so he could walk his own path. Ray, my faithful investigator, would sometimes bring me discreet news about him. "He's working hard, Elias," he told me once, a note of surprise in his voice. "Comes in early, leaves late, no complaints. He seems like a different man." Daniel's transformation was not immediate, nor was it easy. I knew he was facing his own demons, the shame of public humiliation, the loss of his wife, and the weight of his choices. But slowly, Ray's reports became more consistent. Daniel was applying himself, learning, rebuilding. He hadn't reached out to me again, and I respected his space, knowing this journey of self-discovery was his to make. I was also learning the art of loving from a distance, of giving space for the seed I had planted to grow. One afternoon, as I was pruning one of Helen's rose bushes, the phone rang. It was an unknown number. Hesitantly, I answered, "Dad." The voice on the other end was Daniel's. It wasn't the arrogant Daniel, nor the desperate one. It was a tired voice, but with a touch of humility that made me grip the phone tightly. I just wanted you to know that I get it. I get everything you did for me, and I get the lesson. I'm learning to like building something for myself." A lump formed in my throat. There was no explicit apology, but his words were the most sincere one I could have received. I didn't cry, but my heart filled with an unspeakable emotion. "I know, son," I replied, my voice thick. "I know." The call ended, and I remained there, in the garden, the tears finally streaming down my face, not of sadness, but of a profound relief, of a renewed hope. The lesson had been hard for both of us. Sometimes, a father's greatest act of love is not to give his son everything, but to let him learn to build something for himself, to find his own worth. I had won, yes, but the real victory wasn't the house or the estate. It was the possibility of reconstruction, the chance to see my son, even from afar, find his way back. Life went on, with its sorrows and its joys, but now I embraced it with a lighter heart, a heart that, despite its scars, still believed in the power of a new beginning and the quiet strength of love. The journey had been arduous, but it had brought me back to myself, to Helen, and perhaps one day, to a new kind of connection with Daniel. The future was uncertain, but hope, now, was a flower blooming in my garden.